If I told you that inflation is coming down, most of you would say, what rubbish. Mehangai बढ़ रही है. Something that cost 100 rupees a few years back is probably costing 140 rupees today. How can you say Mehangai is going down? And opposition parties love Mehangai.
जहां जाओ मुद्दा तो बेरोजगारी और महंगाई है. ट्रेनों में, फ्लाइट में, बसों में, रेलवे स्टेशन पर, चाय की दुकानों पर.
It allows them to make posters like this. Now, there is something supremely stupid about saying that 5 years back things were cheaper. Why? Well, because prices are meant to go up every year. If prices are coming down, then the economy is in trouble, because that would indicate that there may not be enough demand in the economy. It's called deflation. And trust me, deflation is not a matter of aspiration, it's a matter of desperation. I guess at the heart of this ambiguity is the fundamental difference between prices and inflation. Inflation is the rate of change in prices. And this is typically what the government and the RBI are in the business of controlling. Here's a simple example. Let's say today something costs 100 rupees. Next year it costs 110 rupees. So that's 10% inflation. Let's say the year after that, price goes up to 115 rupees. So from 110 to 115. That's 4.5% inflation. Now, economists will tell you that this is great news. Inflation has fallen from 10% to 4.5%. No one will say, oh, too bad. The 100 rupees item is no longer available 2 years later at the same 100 rupees. In fact, the RBI, which is effectively in charge of controlling inflation, has a target of 4%, which means that for a growing economy like India, the best case outcome is something costing 100 rupees today becoming 104 rupees next year. Because it's impossible to have growth without having inflation. You will notice that in this poster, very strategically, the prices are mentioned in random years, but not the inflation rate. And I think the problem could be in the way the Hindi word Mehangai is defined, or rather left vague. For most people, the first thing that Mehangai brings to their minds is higher prices, not necessarily something as nuanced as inflation. And usually when people are complaining about Mehangai, what they're actually complaining about is that what was affordable a couple of years back is now no longer in their budget. Well, then technically that's not inflation, it's affordability. The problem is that your income hasn't grown as much as inflation has. So in real terms, that is adjusted for inflation, you feel poorer. So prices, affordability, inflation, the term Mehangai doesn't seem to differentiate between them. And look, you might say, so what? If someone is barely able to make their ends meet, how does it matter if Mehangai means prices or inflation or affordability? True. But the issue is that the economics of each are very different. So if you want to treat the disease, you need to first agree on the diagnosis. Hello and welcome to The Bond Economist, your one-stop destination for professional advice on the economy. My name is Aurodeep Nandi, and today we discuss a topic that politicians love to speak about but seem to understand little about: Mehangai. More specifically, inflation. Is it going up? Is it going down? What is driving it? What is the government doing about it? Where is it headed? And as always, if you like what you see, please hit subscribe. If you'd like to contribute to this no frills operation, the super thanks button is below. And those of you who are regular viewers of this channel, you may have noticed that in tandem with our Lok Sabha elections, I have been making a series of videos around burning economic issues and debates in our country. I have talked about the kind of economics Congress is suggesting, how that differs from what the BJP has in mind. Has the Modi government indeed forgiven lakhs of crores of corporate loans? Has it lost the plot on unemployment? And the main motivation behind these videos are not to support one party or the other, but to hopefully offer an unbiased take that kind of dispels a lot of the half-truths and mistruths that I see floating around in social media. Unfortunately, the YouTube algorithm stops promoting videos to new audiences after a few days of posting the video. You can see how YouTube just tapers off the views. So, in case you haven't seen these videos, please take a look. I've left the links in the description, and please do share them. That way the algorithm again wakes up. So first things first, what on earth does inflation actually signify? Let's say we list out all the things you spend on every day: food, toothpaste, utensils, transportation cost, the bunch of stuff that you keep ordering from e-commerce sites, going to hotels, buying an internet plan, getting an airline ticket, everything. Now suppose you noted down the price of each of these items every day, and now you multiply the price of each with how important that item is in your budget. So let's say you spend 10% of your budget on transport, 7% on let's say vegetables, 8% on utensils. So multiply these shares with the price of each item and add them all up. Essentially, this is your consumer price index, or CPI. It is the representative price of your household basket at any point of time. I mean, of course, the calculation is a little more complicated than what I just explained, and I won't bore you with the statistics, but this is essentially the core concept. So you take CPI today, you take CPI a year back, you find out by how much percent it has gone up or gone down, and that gives you consumer price index inflation, CPI inflation. Essentially, what you're doing is the change in the weighted average price of your household basket. But why is it the case that when government statistics say that inflation is so and so percent, on the ground you somehow feel that the sting is much more? Well, look, the government allocates the importance or the weight to the price of any item based on a representative Indian consumer. So it assumes that, okay, let's take a representative Indian consumer, and what are the shares of various items in that Indian consumer's basket. But hey, we are a population of around 140 crores. So it's near impossible to have one consumer represent all of us. And that creates problems. Generally, people who are poorer, for instance, spend a bigger chunk of their budget on food, which means that tomorrow, if say onion or dal prices were to shoot up, then the hit to the budget of a poor household is going to be much higher than that of a well-to-do household. Similarly, if you say drive a car, then a petrol price hike will hit you much more than a person who say takes the bus or the train. Also, sometimes official statistics simply fail to capture obvious price trends that you see around you. Take rent inflation, for instance. If government data is to be believed, rent inflation is going down. But if you are out there in rented accommodation at this point, well, you're probably facing escalating rents. Reports suggest that tier 1 cities have seen a 30 to 40% hike in rents. Meanwhile, rent inflation, the official rent inflation in India, is currently falling and trending close to 3%. So the other reason why you might feel this disconnect with data is just based on how it's collected on the ground and aggregated at a national level. And the third reason is what I had mentioned earlier. Generally, people are less worried about inflation and more about whether they can afford that inflation, which means that if inflation is 5%, is my income at least growing by 6 or 7% such that on a net basis, or what we also call real income basis, I'm able to sustain myself. Now, I had flagged this in my previous video on India's employment situation. Around 60% of our workforce is self-employed. Another 22% are casually employed. And only 20% or so are regular workers, salaried workers. Now, government's own data suggests that adjusted for inflation, regular salaried workers earn 1.5 times more than the self-employed in our country and make more than double of what casual workers earn. And how is it that the incomes of these three categories have grown? Well, in the last 4 years, adjusted for inflation, actually it's the casual workers, the ones who earn the least within the workforce, that have seen the biggest annual increase on average. For the majority self-employed, there's hardly been any increase. And in fact, if you are a salaried regular worker, your real monthly incomes have actually declined. The fact that incomes for a majority of the population, or rather workforce, has either barely grown or shrunk once adjusted for inflation, probably explains why people seem to complain so much about Mehangai. But that begs the question, what makes inflation go up in the first place? Broadly speaking, three factors. The first two are actually kind of obvious: demand and supply. So, for instance, if crops get destroyed due to the weather acting up, that will reduce production, and lower supply means higher prices. In the case of things like clothing, footwear, utensils, ornaments, if input costs go up, like yarn, leather, aluminium, gold, etc., or say your fuel costs go up, then manufacturers pass on these higher costs to retailers, who in turn seek to pass on these higher costs to consumers. And hopefully it's getting evident here that some of these are essentially linked to international factors. So if metal prices globally were to surge, or say like it's happening currently, geopolitical tensions in the Middle East with militants attacking ships in the Red Sea. So whenever there are supply chains that get disrupted, then the hit to inflation sometimes becomes unavoidable. And by the way, it may not seem obvious to us consumers, but there are a few things where the government actively intervenes in the market to control prices. Classic examples are prices of petrol, diesel, kerosene, electricity, where even though in theory the government may say that, hey, we don't control prices, government agencies who supply these to the public end up keeping prices constant for a long time, even when it is no longer economical for them to sell at those prices. They are essentially undertaking losses so that we, the consumers, are protected from the actual cost of, say, purchasing a liter of fuel or an unit of electricity. But the problem is that you can't do this forever. So every now and then these companies are forced to tweak prices, and whenever that happens, it obviously impacts inflation. And then there's the demand side. When the economy grows, when the government spends a lot of money, demand picks up, and so inflation goes up. Growth, remember, causes inflation, and that's where the RBI steps in. The RBI uses interest rates as a regulator. Higher interest rates reduce growth. So the idea is that if a home loan, for instance, becomes too expensive, you wouldn't buy a house, which in turn will moderate the demand for cement, steel, paint, labor, etc. And when you control growth, you control demand, you can control inflation. Well, at least that part of inflation that's sensitive to demand. But there's also a third way in which inflation goes up, and this one isn't so direct. It's to do with expectations. Suppose you go to a store. The salesman tells you that the price of something that you're looking to buy will most definitely go up in a week's time. What would you do? You would say, what the hell, let me buy the product today. But now imagine if millions of people like you are picking up that product today, expecting that things will get more expensive tomorrow. Inflation will start to rise today itself because everyone is already taking things off the shelf. This is called inflation expectations, and it is any central bank's worst nightmare. The situation where inflation gets so much out of control that people lose trust in the central bank's ability to bring inflation down. They expect inflation to rise even further in the future, and so they hoard things today, making it a self-fulfilling vicious cycle. So the RBI regularly conducts surveys and monitors household inflation expectations very carefully. Also, if your perception of inflation is high, you end up demanding more wages. You demand more wages, firms raise the cost of their goods and services, which then contributes to higher inflation, which then leads you to demand higher wages. It's called a wage inflation spiral, and it's the other thing that can give the RBI sleepless nights. So, what is the state of inflation currently in the country? Do we really have a reason to worry? Before the pandemic, we actually had inflation pretty much under control, around 3.5% or so. primarily because food inflation was quite low. But then the pandemic came, supply chains got disrupted, global commodity prices then shot up. Between FY21 to FY23, India's inflation averaged over 6%. And by the way, the RBI's target is 4%. The RBI had to hike interest rates from 4% to 6.5% to try to slow down growth to control inflation. And to their credit, inflation fell from 6.7% in FY23 to 5.4% in FY24. And the RBI expects it to further moderate to around 4.5% in FY25. Also, household inflation expectations have remained under control. And while we don't have good data on urban wages, the official data on rural wages suggests that they are quite subdued. So there's little risk of a wage inflation spiral. But is this comfort on inflation just because of the RBI? Well, not quite. See, our consumer price index basket comprises broadly of three categories: food and beverages, that account for around 47% of the basket; fuel and light, that account for around 7%, and the remaining is core inflation. Core inflation is inflation x food and fuel. Things like clothing, transportation, personal care, housing, recreational stuff, household goods and services. Now, central banks are really interested about this part of inflation because it can't control the weather, it can't control global prices, but it can control the demand in the economy, which in turn should affect the prices of these core goods and services. So in India, what we are observing is this very interesting thing that while food inflation has been elevated, core inflation has been sharply falling. Now, food inflation being high per se is not surprising. After all, we've had a series of bad news for the last couple of years, with the Russia-Ukraine war disrupting supplies, terrible heat phases in India followed by wonky monsoons. But even then, the government has managed to keep a lid on food inflation by taking steps like banning some key agri-exports, by not allowing minimum support prices or MSPs to rise as much, basically prioritizing the consumer over the farmer. But it is this fall in core inflation that has left economists scratching their heads. I mean, one reason why core inflation has fallen is probably because manufacturing costs have come down significantly in the year. And so companies haven't felt the need to pass on higher costs to consumers. Part of this, by the way, also could reflect the government's focus on fiscal discipline. When a government spends unsustainably more than it earns, it risks overheating the economy and causing inflation. So the government keeping fiscal deficit under control is also partly the reason for lower core inflation. And the other reason also is that the government has ensured lower petrol and diesel prices, which in India's case is part of the core basket and not the fuel basket. So public sector oil marketing companies have been prevailed upon to not raise prices even when crude oil prices were rising, and then before elections they again cut prices. But still, despite these factors, core inflation is cooling a bit too rapidly for India. And if indeed our economy is growing by 7 to 8% as our GDP statistics are telling us, then core inflation at record lows of close to 3% levels just doesn't make sense. I mean, it has averaged over 5% in the last decade, reaching as high as 6 to 7% at times. So 3% levels is quite low. Because, if you had strong demand in the economy, it should push inflation higher from these levels. But if core inflation is so low, does this indirectly suggest that demand in the economy might be weaker than what growth numbers are suggesting? So hopefully you now have some idea on how inflation is not just something that you can turn on and turn off with a remote control, as politicians like to put it. But instead, it's a far more complicated economic process where it is linked to growth in the economy and is often influenced by a bunch of things that we actually have little control over. Talking of control though, it is interesting to hear the kind of solutions that the opposition seems to suggest as far as controlling inflation is concerned. By the way, for the record, the Congress manifesto for the 2024 Lok Sabha elections mentions that they want to tackle inflation without offering any concrete measures. But that said, if you go by the general naarebaazi, there seems to be a strong leftist overtone to their imagined solutions. Cut prices of petrol, diesel, LPG, electricity, as if the government has increased these prices for their own manoranjan. Typically, energy costs depend on the prices of fuel globally. If global crude oil prices are high and you're forcing oil marketing companies to sell petrol, diesel, kerosene, LPG at lower prices, they are essentially taking a hit to their balance sheets. If you are giving free power or highly subsidized power to people in your state, then your state electricity board is making huge losses. And then either you find a way to make these public companies whole, which means that you indirectly are using your budget to provide energy subsidies, in the process sacrificing valuable money that could go to vital parts of the economy like infrastructure, healthcare, education, etc., but can't because you're giving these subsidies, or you let these companies bleed till they become sick and unable to function without a bailout. And if Mehangai is defined by affordability, and if the Congress manifesto talks of giving 1 lakh rupee to every poor family or waiving off education loans and whatnot, I mean, these could backfire royally. Even if we keep aside the fact that these will completely ruin our budget, artificially boosting demand ultimately risks higher inflation, which ironically hits the poor the hardest. So the next time you hear any politician come up and say, महंगाई बढ़ रही है, vote for me, ask them, वो तो ठीक है, but पहले अपना plan तो बताइए. For more such insights, like, share and subscribe to The Bond Economist.